Thank you for tuning into our podcast. We are coming to you from Holyoke, Massachusetts. I am your host, Carrie, and I am here with our very own historian, Robert Coon, who is the founder and also the tour guide of the historical tours of Greater Holyoke. He offers both public and private tours of the local canal systems, reservoirs, cemeteries, as well as various parks and streets in Holyoke, South Hadley, and Chicopee, Massachusetts. You can check out his website for more information at holyokecanaltour.org. There he has videos and past and present photos, as well as his 2023 schedule. So today we'll be discussing the burial grounds of Holyoke throughout its history. Now, there are many locations where people are buried in Holyoke, Mass. So what are the various types of cemeteries?
Okay, it depends who has died. For instance, there are Native American cemeteries in Holyoke. There are, of course, Protestant and Catholic cemeteries in Holyoke. And each of those cemeteries will have a different reason to exist. They have their own personality. Now, it turns out there's a breakdown of about 4 ways you can look at a cemetery. First kind is a family cemetery, which usually grows into a neighborhood cemetery through the centuries, but it's usually started by one family and built from there. There's a churchyard cemetery, which starts right alongside a church, in the side yard of a church, and then builds from there. The church might have gone away, been taken down, and you might not know there was a church there, but it's still a churchyard cemetery. These are very common ones. There's also lawn cemeteries, which are cemeteries that are very simple in design. They have very straight rows of gravestones. And the most beautiful of all is the garden cemetery, also called a rural cemetery, which will have curved lines in its rows of gravestone, and in the roads of access will have beautiful exotic trees throughout it. We'll have beautiful chapels inside of it. The first garden-style cemetery is Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is in Massachusetts. So there's a lot of different ways you look at a cemetery, and there's lots of examples around Massachusetts of each type. In fact, most towns will have 1 or 2 types, and some of the bigger cities will have all 4 types. So we'll be looking at them.
Okay, so how about you give an example of each of them in Holyoke?
Okay, I'll start with the Native American ones. The Native American ones are on Depot Hill, and I'll talk about that later on, really. But just to mention that, to get it out of the way. Then the 4 types that were made by the settlers of any given town, I'll give an example of each one in Holyoke, which is, for its size, pretty good to have an example of all 4. Towns might not have that, but cities, they usually are large enough to have all that. So a family cemetery, for instance, a Rock Valley Cemetery in western part of Holyoke is a cemetery started by the Ludden-Tunk family, and it was made because a young Ludington child had died, and it stayed mostly Ludington family, but other families in western Holyoke started burying here too. Same with Smith's Ferry Cemetery, that started out as a Smith family cemetery, but the first person buried there is Rachel Lyman. So this started out as one family, but even before one of their family members was buried there, some other family was buried there too. So going on to the next one, which is the churchyard cemeteries. Now, there used to be 3 churchyard cemeteries in Holyoke. What happened, though, is only one person was buried in each one of those churchyards, and that was the founder, the pastor of each of the 3. The Rosary Church had its first pastor, the Precious Blood Church had its first pastor, and the St. Jerome's Church had its first pastor, buried alongside the church with a tombstone. Now, the Rosary and the Precious Blood churchyard cemeteries are no longer there because the churches were taken down, and that founder pasture has been moved to another cemetery within either Holyoke or South Hadley. Now, St. Jerome's Churchyard Cemetery still exists, and it's the only location where a single individual takes up the whole cemetery. So this is cool to look at. Now, next one, lawn cemeteries. Well, Calvary Cemetery is a great example. The Elmwood Cemetery is another example. But that's very close to being a churchyard cemetery also, because the church was across the street. The St. Jerome Cemetery is definitely an example of a lawn cemetery. And so all of these are trumped by the last one, and that's a garden cemetery or a rural cemetery. And in Holyoke, you definitely have one. It's called Forestdale. The roads are curved. The rows of gravestones are curved patterns. You have bushes and trees. You have a beautiful environment inside of it. And this is by far the nicest place in Holyoke to be buried. It doesn't look like Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge and Watertown, but it's a beautiful garden-style cemetery that Holyoke should be very, very proud of.
Now, so this is a presentation and not a tour. So what are some of the features that you cover?
Yes, during the presentation I may cover all of these locations where people are buried, and there are many in Holyoke. Now, it includes South Hadley, 3 South Hadley cemeteries. The reason why is because 3 churches in Holyoke had their cemeteries in South Hadley. Another feature I covered is the year that the cemetery was started and why it was even started. Was it a church, one church to one cemetery, or was it multiple churches that had one cemetery? Like the Notre Dame Cemetery was actually 2 different churches shared a cemetery, and that would be Perpetual Help Church and Immaculate Conception Church shared the Notre Dame Cemetery, started in 1891. So I cover these facets, and I cover what family started them, what church was nearby, and I make sure I cover all the Protestant cemeteries. And there you have to be careful because a lot of Protestant cemeteries were churchyard cemeteries, even though the church is long gone. So I mentioned one, the Elmwood Cemetery, but there's one cemetery in Holyoke that's not there anymore. It was moved, and that was the Congregational Cemetery near the corner of Northampton Street and Hampden Street. It had its church across Northampton Street, and both are gone. So you would never know that unless I tell you about it. And that's why I like to make this a presentation and not a tour, because you're all over the place in 2 different communities, and you also have places that are totally gone now.
And so now tell us about Depot Hill.
Now, Depot Hill is really a very amazing location. It's the hill immediately behind the modern train station of Holyoke, and in the year 1868, the company called Mosier and Bowers were digging into the earth, making Mosier and Bowers Street and Eli Street in Holyoke, which is in the flats. And what they find? They found burials of Native Americans. The adult bodies were buried such that the legs were buried horizontally. The torso was angled 90 degrees upwards, so you had the torso, the chest, and the head in a vertical position, and all was packed into bright red clay. And they found children that weren't buried like this. They were more buried in traditional horizontal fashion. And they found some artifacts also, including little tubes that matched the Adena tribe of Ohio. So this tribe in Holyoke must have been traded with the Adena tribe of Ohio. And that tribe believed in burial mound burials. This was not a burial mound. It was on a mound, look to it, but it wasn't a burial mound. They probably buried there because it looked like a mound already. And so How many did they find? In 1968, 1969, and 1868, 1869, and 1870, 3 years where they graded the roads and prepared for buildings, they found 60 burials. Right? 32 were found the first year alone. That is incredible. The bones were brought eventually by Edward Hitchcock, the son of the geologist and president of Amherst College. They were brought to Amherst College 32 years ago during the repatriation year. They had to give them away to Native American tribes, and they did so. But they didn't give a precise record of who they gave them away to. But Holyoke is the second largest location of one-site Native Americans, which is an incredible fact. The reason why I think this happened was Holyoke was at a meander of the Connecticut River and at a location called the Hadley Falls, where the water dropped 30 feet in one location and kept dropping another 30 feet. The Native Americans waited until the fish would go upstream, hit the falls area, and would go slower through the rapids because it was hard going upstream. And the Indians, Native Americans, would go out there and grab the fish by hand because the fish had to go so slow. And also the soil in the area had lots of silt. Beyond the clay area had lots of silt. And it was a great place, thus, to both fish and to farm. And so 1,000 years ago, there must have been a pretty large tribe of Native Americans in the Holyoke area. So thank you for this podcast.
Thank you for tuning in again, and you can check out his website at holyokecanaltour.org for more information on his tours, and you can also check out some more of the podcasts. Thank you.